It's 2005, and Christmas festivities are in full swing. Coloured fairy lights twinkle through the dark of the evening. Merry music plays on the radio in shops and pubs across the country. Friends, families and neighbours come together in celebration. In Castleblaney, County Monaghan, a young woman opens the door to a family friend. The two are the same age and have been friends since attending the Gaeltacht together, back when they were in school. He lives nearby. He's drunk, but not slurring. She thinks he should stay for a while to sober up before driving home. They sit down in her living room. He is not his usual self. There's clearly something on his mind. He asks her if she's heard about a murder earlier that year, one 30 minutes away in Dundalk. She says she has. "I did that," he says. She doesn't believe him. He can tell she doesn't believe him. He wants to convince her. He wants someone to know. He begins to describe how he stabbed the woman multiple times as she stood at our back door. He stands up and shows her how he cut the woman's throat. Her heart pounds as she listens to him. He tells her he felt high after the murder. She frantically tries to think of ways to get him out of the house. He continues to talk about the murder, insisting that she can search it on the internet if she doesn't believe him. She convinces him it's time to go home, so he gets into his car and drives away. She watches the red glow of his car taillights get further and further away, until he disappears from view. When someone is killed in Ireland, the Gardaí call in a specialist unit of forensic crime scene examiners from the Technical Bureau. This is Ireland's real-life version of CSI, but it's nothing like the movies or TV shows. For 25 years, I was one of the detectives on that team. My name is John Sweetman. My job as a Garda detective in the Technical Bureau was to read the evidence that could not speak for itself. I learned to see what others might miss. Fingerprints smudged on the handle of a door, weapons disguised in everyday objects, handwritten notes that revealed more than the writer ever intended. The smallest traces often unravelled a bigger story, and now I'm here to tell you those stories. In this podcast from GoLoud, I take you inside some of Ireland's most haunting investigations. This is Lines of Enquiry, a GoLoud original podcast that follows the evidence step by step and tries to uncover the real story behind the headlines. In this episode, two mothers lost within the same year, a 20-year fight for justice, and a confession that raises more questions than it answers. After the turn of the 20th century, a tide of new ideas and styles began to flood Europe. It was the beginning of a new modern era, and with it came a new style of design and architecture, Art Deco. Known for its sleek lines, symmetry and geometric forms, Art Deco expanded beyond its origins in Paris to influence the construction of everything from iconic skyscrapers like the Chrysler Building in New York to stately homes in Ireland. In Dundalk, County Louth, one such Art Deco home was built on Domain Road, a flat-roofed, two-storey home with long, sleek horizontal lines, painted a cool shade of white. It sat on a substantial plot of land where, in years gone by, locals could access ice for food preservation. As years went on, the home became known locally as Ice House. By April of 2005, Ice House was home to 43-year-old Irene White, her daughters, 17-year-old Jennifer and 4-year-old Darren, and her 6-year-old son, Darren. Outside the house, in the lawns that backed up onto surrounding Ice House Hill Park, with its duck pond and blooming crocuses and daffodils, sat a mobile home. Irene's mother, Maureen, had moved into it 2 years earlier. She left the family home in nearby Omeath, where Irene had grown up, along the coast of the Cooley Peninsula in northern Louth, to be closer to her daughter. Maureen had been very affected by the death of her husband, Irene's father, Matthew, a few years beforehand. Irene was also separated from her husband, Alan White, and since moving to the mobile home, the mother and daughter had created a new daily routine. Maureen would regularly call for tea and a chat, usually around 12 o'clock. Irene took great pride in her home and garden. She loved nature and carefully tended her organic herb garden and vegetable patch. She was creative and enthusiastic with whatever she got involved in, whether that was her participation in local pub dramas, the Omead Development Association, or her Bowron practice. She had been studying physiotherapy and reflexology, and she could offer suggestions of alternative medicines to cure all sorts of ailments. She had begun treating people in her home with Reiki and aromatherapy, as well as working selling Avon makeup. And before all of that, Irene had briefly worked part-time as a receptionist for a security company run by a friend of her husband, a man named Niall Power. After a few violent incidents in the town, an elaborate security system was installed in Ice House. It included a camera intercom at the front door, panic buttons, and security lights. Although Irene had tried to maintain it, the security system had fallen into disrepair and deteriorated after Alan removed the cameras to install them at another property of his. Irene was alone in the house trying to raise her children, having separated from Alan the previous August after a turbulent few years of marriage. Tensions between the two escalated when telecoms company Eircom offered nearly €1 million to buy the house. Alan had bought the property for just £66,000 in 1995, 3 years before the couple married. Now he wanted to sell up for a substantial profit. But Irene had reservations about how the money would be divided, and the sale was dragging on. On the morning of April 6, 2005, like other parents in the town, Irene dropped her children to school. It was a crisp spring day. At the gates of the National School, Irene chatted with another mother for about an hour about the sale of the house and the collapse of her marriage. She had begun looking at other properties in the area. Then Irene felt something wet fall on her head. Bird droppings. It brought the conversation to a swift end as Irene left quickly to wash her auburn hair. She arrived back home at 9:50 that morning. Just 25 minutes later, at 10:15 a.m, a local woman spotted a young man in a dark jacket and peak cap running across the neighbouring Ice House Hill Park. She felt frightened of him and looked away, avoiding eye contact. He got into a car and drove away. Across the Irish Sea in Manchester, England, Irene's sister Anne was in her home. She was laying on her bed chatting to her husband Kenneth when a bird flew into the window. Anne was unsettled by it, fearing it was a premonition. Back in Dundalk, around 12:30, her mother Maureen walked across the yard towards Irene's house, as she always did, for a chat and a cup of tea. Maureen found the door was unlocked. It seemed strange, but she was grateful for it as she sometimes struggled opening the lock. With her yellow mug in her hand, she stepped into the utility room. The radio was on, blaring at full volume. Maureen opened the door into the kitchen. Nothing appeared normal. The kitchen table had been moved, and the chairs had fallen over. Broken glass covered the floor. And there, lying in a pool of blood, was her daughter, Irene. Her head was propped up against the washing machine. She was wearing her orange dish gloves. The sink was still full of water. It appeared she had been washing up. Maureen ran from the house to a nearby shop looking for help. As she ran, she prayed that her legs wouldn't give out from under her. The shop owner, Tony Hines, was at the till with a customer when Maureen arrived. He heard her shout, "Will you come down quick? Irene is lying dead on the floor." Tony ran back to Ice House, hoping that Maureen was wrong about what she'd seen. But as soon as he saw Irene's body for himself, he rushed back outside to call 999. Gardaí were still examining the scene when Jennifer, Irene's eldest daughter from an earlier marriage, arrived home. She had already been told of her mother's death, but not of the tragic circumstances. She arrived at the house. She spotted the Gardaí and camera crews outside. She then realised what had happened. She got inside and saw her nanny, Maureen, and at that moment her world began to crumble. In Manchester, Anne's phone rang. One of Irene's friends was calling. She answered and time stood still. Everything went into slow motion. News of the crime began to spread around the town. Alan White, Irene's estranged husband, rang the Garda station from a conference over an hour away in City West, County Dublin, to find out what had happened. It was clear to Gardaí that Irene had suffered a brutal death. Her killer had stabbed her multiple times. Irene's eyes were still open. The scene was so gruesome that even years later those Gardaí and emergency responders who were there would say that that day had never left them. Irene had been murdered. That much was clear. While a forensic examination of the house was underway, Gardaí began going door to door, looking for information and witnesses. One witness recalled seeing a dark-coloured Peugeot outside Ice House earlier that day. Gardaí spoke to the woman who saw a man running through neighbouring Ice House Hill Park that morning. They sealed off the park as they trimmed back hedges and shrubs within the grounds, searching for any clues. DNA evidence from the killer was recovered at the scene, but in 2005 there was no centralised database, so without a suspect to compare it to, there was little Gardaí could do with it. There was blood on the handle of the back door, and bloody footprints led from Irene's body in the kitchen, out the front door, and over the wall into Ice House Hill Park. Detective Garda Shane Curran from the Garda Technical Bureau made a cast of the footprint. The killer had been wearing Nike Air International Max runners, between size 9 and 10. The post-mortem revealed that Irene had suffered 34 different stab wounds. It was frenzied. It was not the work of an experienced killer. The knife used would have been about 9 inches to a foot long, but no knives were missing from the house. The killer had come prepared. Gardaí spoke to Irene's estranged husband, Alan White, who had been at a security conference in Dublin when the killing took place. Gardaí checked with Alan White's 2 associates who had travelled to Dublin with him for the conference, who confirmed his attendance. Another man, Niall Power, a former employer of Irene's and an associate of her husband, had planned to travel with them, but after receiving a phone call around 9:30 that morning, he decided not to attend. Gardaí asked Niall about that call. He claimed it was a fake call to get him out of travelling in the car with someone he disliked. Alan White gave Gardaí the name of a teenage petty criminal, telling them that Irene had had a run-in with him. The name was also brought up by Niall Power. In a statement to Gardaí, Power said, "I can't think of any reason why this has happened, and I don't know her to have had any enemies." He said the only dispute he knew her to have had was with the same teenager named by Irene's husband, Alan. Gardaí investigated the young criminal, but quickly dismissed him from their inquiries. Gardaí could find no records of Irene having had any serious disputes with anyone. There was no sign of forced entry on the doors or windows, and nothing in the house appeared to have been stolen. Irene's handbag and the money inside remained untouched, hanging in the hallway outside of the kitchen. This was not a burglary. No sexual motive could be established either. It seemed whoever killed Irene had planned it and had a personal motive to want her dead. Dundalk is right on the border between the Republic and Northern Ireland. During the Troubles, paramilitary activity was widespread, with an estimated 400 members of the Provisional IRA living in the town. Although the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 had led the way to begin disarmament and decommissioning of the Provisional IRA, It would not be until later in 2005 that this process was complete. Gardaí considered the possibility a former Republican paramilitary killed Irene. On the 9th of April 2005, on a bitterly cold morning, Irene White was laid to rest in her native Omeath. Classmates of her children donned their uniforms and stood in a guard of honour, blinking back tears as the hearse passed. A large pink and white floral arrangement spelling out Mum lay beside the coffin. Father Mark O'Hagan compared Irene's tragic death to a blackout, saying, "1 minute she is here, full of light. The next, nothing, only darkness." Irene's sister Anne spoke of her peaceful and caring sister who did not deserve the cruel end she met. Anne also reflected on her 70-year-old mother's shock at finding her daughter in a pool of blood. She talked of their mother's difficulty coming to terms with what she had seen that day. As the family grieved, the investigation continued. The team working on the case expanded to over 100 members of An Garda Síochána. They continued to appeal for information. One person who came forward was a doorman who worked in nearby Drogheda. He told investigators how, not long before Irene's murder, he had been approached and offered €35,000 to arrange the death of a woman. He thought it was a joke. Gardaí began to wonder, had someone been paid to kill Irene? Gardaí took over 300 statements in those first few months. One of these, taken on the day of Irene's funeral, was from Niall Power's ex-girlfriend. She told them she often heard Niall and an associate discuss how they would have Irene killed. She had warned Irene after she overheard them discussing potential plans to kill her. Detectives knew they needed to speak to Niall Power again. When they did, Power called his former girlfriend crazy and claimed that she had it in for him. Gardaí asked him about his movements on the 6th of April. He told them that he had spent the morning with his girlfriend before he went to meet one of his part-time employees at the security firm, a 22-year-old student named Anthony Lamb. In a voluntary statement made to Gardaí on the 21st of April, 2 weeks after Irene's murder, that student, Anthony Lamb, explained how he met with Power on the day of Irene's murder. He said the meeting was in relation to collecting an advance on his wages. He had planned a trip to the UK for his girlfriend's graduation. Financial records showed Power withdrew €1,000 from the permanent TSB in Dundalk town centre at 10:41 a.m. on the day of the murder. Lamb told Gardaí that he was not in Dundalk at the time of the murder, but rather was buying trousers 30 minutes away in his hometown of Castleblaney, County Monaghan. When asked later about her killing, Lamb told detectives it didn't really affect him, because, despite being aware of her husband Alan White, he didn't know Irene White and had never been to Icehouse. Despite the claims of his ex-girlfriend, there was nothing else to suggest that Niall Power had anything to do with Irene's murder, and he had an alibi. But even with that, Gardaí did not rule him out of their investigation. As the investigation inched forward slowly, more tragedy hit the family of Irene White on what would have been her 44th birthday. Her mother, Maureen, passed away suddenly just 6 months after her daughter. It was shortly after a failed legal injunction by Maureen and Jennifer to stop Alan White from selling Icehouse for €1.1 million. The family felt that Maureen McBride died of a broken heart. Irene's sister Anne believed whoever killed Irene had done so knowing the routines of the house and deliberately timed the killing so that she would be found by her mother. Gardaí were doing their best to trawl through CCTV from the area to get a better idea of Irene's movements that day. They traced her maroon Mazda to and from her home to the children's schools. They noticed a white Ford Fiesta van with an orange stripe along the side, passing by Icehouse around 45 minutes before Irene was found by her mother. The driver of the van was Niall Power. Gardaí had questioned Power about his movements that day. He had never mentioned being so near Ice House. On the 24th of May 2006, Gardaí arrested Niall Power and Alan White on suspicion of withholding information. Gardaí believed that whoever killed Irene had been paid a substantial amount of money, and they wanted to view Alan White and Niall Power's financial records and call records, as well as searching their homes for further clues. Gardaí began to question Alan. Mostly he replied to their questions with no comment. He repeated those two words 303 times over the 2 days of interviews. In another interview room, Gardaí received similar replies from Niall Power. Neither man revealed anything during the interrogation. Detectives spent weeks examining all the calls and texts sent in Dundalk on the morning Irene was killed, hoping to find the start of a thread that may lead them to the truth. But despite their exhaustive trawl of the records, there was no forensic evidence or telephone data to connect the men to the crime in any way. As a result of the limited hard evidence, both men were released after 36 hours without charge. The investigation was beginning to run dry. A €10,000 reward was offered through Crime Stoppers, but it remained unclaimed. The media soon learned of Alan White's arrest and release and flocked to speak to him. In one interview in the Star on Sunday, Alan agreed that he was a suspect, but insisted that he did not kill Irene. In November of 2006, Irene's sister Anne brought a psychic to visit the area near Ice House. Standing in the cold winter air on the path along Domain Road, the two took in the white flat-roofed house that had been Irene's home. Glamorous and dark-haired psychic Diane Lazarus held Irene's photograph in her hand. She said she could visualise the inside of the house and the kitchen. She said she began to see what Irene experienced on the day of her murder. She felt that there was a man waiting for Irene when she returned home from the school run that morning. Claiming she was looking at the killer through Irene's eyes, Diane took note of his face and eyes. She could see this man was determined to kill Irene. The psychic said she was sure Irene knew her killer. Gardaí looked into the information given by the psychic, but were unable to find anything concrete. Anne arranged a vigil and a fundraiser for Women's Aid on the 2nd anniversary of her sister's murder. 126 St. Bridget's crosses were displayed outside Irene's home in honour of the 126 women who had been murdered in Ireland since 1996. Hundreds of people attended the vigil, including families of other murdered women in Ireland who were also awaiting justice. Speaking at the vigil, the aunt of murdered French filmmaker Sophie Toscan de Plantier asked, "Why is justice not being done in this country?" Anne also established an organisation called European Alliance Justice for Families, whose mission was to help other families of women who died violently like her own, and to directly help women who were living in fear. Following the release without charge of Niall Power and Alan White in 2006, the investigation stalled. Despite this, over the next few years, Anne insisted that she would not stop until her sister's murderer or murderers hanged their heads in shame and had to face justice in the courts. She offered a cash reward of €30,000 for the information that could help secure a conviction. Appealing to the killer's conscience, she said, "Irene was an innocent victim, a loving mother of 3 who did not deserve to die like that." Anne also began to campaign for a review of the case by the Serious Crime Review Team. They had had success with some other high-profile cold cases, and Anne was determined that they should take on her sister's case. She would arrive at the team's office for unscheduled meetings, bringing scones with her to convince them. In 2011, then head of the Serious Crime Review Team, Detective Superintendent Christy Mangan, began to look further into the case. He reviewed the files from the original investigation, going over evidence gathered and the questions asked, and the questions left unanswered. As he did, he noticed something. There, in the statements, he found inconsistencies, stories that didn't quite add up. When the cold case review into the death of Irene White began in 2011, Detective Superintendent Christy Mangan reviewed the interviews and statements gathered during the initial investigation. In the 6 years since Irene's murder, Gardaí had struggled to move the investigation on, or to make any sort of breakthrough that would take them closer to finding her killer. The review team looked again at the list of suspects, the bloody shoe prints they found leading from the kitchen to the park, and the witness statements. They identified a further 92 potential witnesses. They delved deeper into the suggestion of paramilitary links. They enlisted the assistance of the Crime and Security Division of the Gardaí, who have intelligence on paramilitary groups in Ireland. A memo arrived at the Serious Crime Review Team office, marked secret. An informant had come forward. They gave Gardaí the names of 2 IRA members. The informant claimed that one of these men had been paid €60,000 to kill Irene White. He had enlisted the help of a junior member of the IRA to carry out the killing. The names given were familiar to the Gardaí. They had previously investigated the men for burglary and firearms offences. It was a credible lead, their first in a while. Gardaí began to investigate the 2 men, beginning with their whereabouts on the morning of April 6, 2005. They discovered that the first man had been in Garda custody that morning under an investigation for firearms offences. He was not released until late at night on the 8th of April, 2 days after Irene had been killed. While he could not have carried out the murder, he could have arranged it, as the informant suggested. The Gardaí switched their attention to the other man, the one reported to have carried out the killing. This man too had been in custody at the time of Irene's death. Another potential lead was ruled out. Then, in October of 2011, a woman called Dundalk Garda station. She wanted to speak about Irene White. She told detectives how, in 2007, while driving by Ice House, her partner at the time mentioned Irene's death and how no one had ever been caught. The man had had a schoolyard crush on Irene when they were growing up, but she had rejected him. A year later, in 2008, the topic of Irene White came up between them again. The man was suffering with mental health struggles and divulged to his girlfriend that he had done something terrible to the woman in Ice House, who he said had rejected him. When the Gardaí went to look further into this man, they discovered he had died by suicide. And with that, another lead had disappeared. In July of 2013, 8 years after Irene's death, a phone rang in the Cold Case Review office. After a beat, a detective answered. There was a woman on the other end. She didn't give her name or her number. Her voice shook as she spoke. She began to speak about feeling burdened by what she knew. She said she lived abroad in Australia and felt homesick. She went on, saying that the feeling of guilt was made worse recently after watching a program about unsolved crimes. Her family had always told her not to get involved, but she had decided to share what she knew. The anonymous caller said she knew Anthony Lamb, the casual employee Niall Power met on the day of the murder, the then 22-year-old student who Gardaí had spoken to in their initial investigation. He had been her neighbour and often called over around Christmas time. When Lamb called to her house in Christmas of 2005, he had made a confession, something that had lived with her and burdened her since that day. He had said that he had killed Irene White. The caller said he told her how he enjoyed the thrill of it. He had even reenacted parts of the brutal attack for her. The woman was terrified by what she heard and did her best to get Lamb to leave her home. As he drove away, she watched his rear lights until they disappeared. She didn't know what to believe. some of the details in his story were sketchy. When she told her family, they were afraid to get involved and warned her not to. So she kept his story to herself for all these years. But no longer. The cold case team could tell that this was not a prank call. This was real. This could be critical. It was the only time that anyone had given them the name of the killer. The anonymous caller spoke to the detectives 3 times over the next few months, but always refused to give her name. The cold case team got in touch with Australian authorities, but given the volume of Irish immigrants in the country, they could do little to help. An estimated 14,100 had left Ireland and made Australia home in 2013 alone. Among those droves of Irish immigrants was the anonymous woman who could be central to the case. Detective Superintendent Mangan reviewed the statements and the telephone data gathered in the initial investigation in 2005. He spotted an inconsistency. Anthony Lamb had told Gardaí that he was shopping in Castleblaney, 30 minutes away from Dundalk, on the morning of Irene's murder. But his phone data for those hours showed his calls were being routed through a Dundalk cell tower. By then studying for a postgraduate degree from Maynooth University, Lamb was a well-liked young man who had very few interactions with Gardaí. Gardaí had not considered him a suspect during the initial investigation, but when the cold case team examined his phone data further, they found something interesting. On the 6th of April 2005, the morning Irene was killed, Lamb had made a number of phone calls. The first at 8:30 a.m, then another call at 9:44 a.m. that lasted just 39 seconds. The next call was at 10:13 a.m, and then a fourth at 11:39 a.m. All calls were to and from the same number. Niall Power. It was new information. It could potentially breathe new life into the investigation. But Gardaí were still far from knowing who was responsible for Irene White's death. In 2015, on the 10th anniversary of her sister's death, Anne Delcassian remained hopeful that Gardaí would find the people responsible. She spoke to the Argus, her local newspaper, about her sister and how she is remembered by her children and her friends. She said, "She is not forgotten and never really gone." That same year, the cold case review team presented a report on the case to detectives in Louth. It was 315 pages long. The team took their time presenting hundreds of recommendations to the local guards and their detective inspector, Pat Murray. The team in Dundalk was small. They had other cases, crimes and policing to undertake in the town. They needed to focus their resources. Some of the suggestions in the report were more urgent than others. Murray knew the anonymous caller was key, and so he assembled his team of detectives and set them to work on figuring out who she was. She spoke with the cold case team 3 times, but at no stage did she leave her name. They traced the calls, which came from a payphone in Australia. They knew they would have to find out her identity from the small clues she left behind in conversation. She told them she was originally from South Monaghan, like Lamb. They knew she was still friends with Anthony Lamb on Facebook. She had told detectives that she was nervous he would be suspicious if he noticed that she removed him as a friend. Detective Garda Bobby Ogle inspected Lamb's Facebook profile. Lamb had a lot of friends from Monaghan, but Detective Garda Ogle was from Monaghan himself, and with that local knowledge, he was able to recognise that most of Lamb's friends were from the north of the county. This seemed odd to the detective. Should he not have more friends closer to home? Detective Ogle looked again at the profile. The profile picture was a group photograph taken from afar. When they looked closer and compared this man to the photographs they had of Anthony Lamb, they realised it was not the same man. Detective Garda Ogle began his search again. He could not find a profile for Anthony Lamb. He decided to ask a Garda sergeant in Monaghan if he knew Lamb. The sergeant looked at his own Facebook account. There was a new notification on his profile. He had a friend request waiting to be accepted. It was from Anton O'Luhan, Lamb's Irish name, and the photograph matched. Detectives now had a new list of friends, but they knew they needed to narrow it down much further. In the second call, which lasted 24 minutes, the anonymous caller had gone into more detail about her friendship with Lamb. She mentioned that they had first met in Irish college at the Gaeltacht when she was 17. Detectives decided to follow that trail and see what it might uncover. They knew when Lamb had been in the Gaeltacht, so they needed to know who else had been there at the same time. To do that, they began by contacting several schools across Monaghan and Irish colleges in Donegal, compiling a list of female students who were in the Gaeltacht at the critical time. 66 of the women on their final list were friends with Anthony Lamb on Facebook. The list was shortening, but they still needed more. To apply for an Australian visa, Irish citizens must obtain a certificate of character from their local Garda station. Detective Garda Ogle wondered if any of the 66 names on the list would be on file in Garda stations around Monaghan. He made contact with the various stations. It had been more than 2 years since this woman had applied for her visa. According to data protection laws, any information containing personal data has to be destroyed after 2 years, including anything that could help identify their mystery woman. Refusing to give up, Detective Ogle had another idea. To give a certificate of character, vetting would need to be carried out. Perhaps there would be a record of this on the Garda Pulse centralised database. He searched the reports from Monaghan for 2 key terms: Garda vetting and Australia. One result stood out. An inquiry that had been made for a woman heading to Australia some years ago. Detective Ogle called the officer who had made the inquiry. She remembered the woman and she could share a copy of the certificate of character. It was for a woman similar in age to Anthony Lamb. There was a home address and the job listed for her in Australia. Could this be her? It could have been critical, or it could have been another crushing moment of false hope. The caller had said she had last met Lamb in a gym in Monaghan. Now, local detectives sought to follow that trail. They set out across Monaghan, visiting gyms, crossing the county, asking if Lamb was a member, or if he had ever attended a class there. For weeks, the team scored through piles of paperwork given to them by the gyms, with the sign-in details for every single person who had used the gym. But they didn't just need to find Lamb's name. They needed to find his name in the same place and at the same time as one of the 66 Facebook friends. And then they spotted something. April 2009. There, on the log, signing out at 7 p.m, was the name Anthony Lamb. And signing in at exactly the same time was a woman. Her name matched one of the 66 Facebook friends who had been in the Gaeltacht at the same time as Lamb, and the certificate of character that they had found. The circle was nearly complete, with one final check to make. Hoping to confirm their breakthrough, they contacted Maynooth University, where their caller said she had studied. They gave the name of the woman. They asked if she had ever been a student at the university. Yes, she had. It had been 3 years since the first anonymous call. Now they finally had a name and an address. They wanted to head to Australia straight away to speak with her in person. So, when Detective Inspector Pat Murray had to wait 2.5 months to get approval to send his detectives to Australia, he was frustrated. Murray threatened to go to the media with an update. And the next day, permission was granted for Detective Bobby Ogle and Detective Rachel Riley to travel to Australia. The 2 detectives were accompanied by an Australian police officer as they approached the woman's home. They knocked at the door and waited for her to answer. She opened the door and said, "My God, what the hell kept you?" She went inside, gathered her things, and left with them to head to the police station, where she would give them a formal statement. Back in Dundalk, detectives continued to find out what they could about Anthony Lamb. They spoke to his ex-girlfriend. The pair had travelled to the UK together on April 6, 2005, the day of Irene's murder. His ex-girlfriend told detectives Lamb had been jittery and nervous, but at the time she believed this was because he had never flown before. She also remembered that he had an unusual amount of cash on him, enough to buy her a new jacket and a dress for his niece. For her birthday, a month after, he bought her an expensive gym membership, concert tickets to see Meatloaf, a night in a B&B, and a bracelet. She also confirmed that Anthony Lamb drove a black Peugeot at the time, the same car a witness had seen outside Ice House on the morning Irene was killed. Gardaí retraced the movements Anthony Lamb had given them for that morning. His timeline didn't add up, and he had no witnesses for large chunks of time. Could he have been watching Irene White? Gardaí were piecing together a detailed profile of Lamb. Plainclothes Gardaí put him under surveillance. He was by then a PhD student in Maynooth University, studying archaeology, early medieval Ireland and Anglo-Saxon studies, and also working as a tutor. He lived at home with his family in Castleblaney. The detectives watched him as he brought his girlfriend's 2 young children to the chipper for food, and as he sat alone at the bar counter having a drink in the pub. As he watched Lamb, one detective thought to himself, "What am I watching here? This bookish and attentive man didn't seem to match with the violent crime he was suspected of." In 2016, Detective Inspector Pat Murray appeared on Crime Call, along with Irene's eldest daughter, Jennifer. Together, they appealed to the public to come forward with anything they knew. In a heartfelt plea, Jennifer said, "I miss her hugs, her touch, just everything. There's a big hole in my life, and nothing will ever fill it. A piece of me died that day." Jennifer also appealed to anyone with information to speak to Gardaí. She told viewers across Ireland, "I want her life to mean something. Some closure, some answers, that's all I want. That's all anyone wants." Irene's sister Anne also refused to let her sister's killer rest, no matter how many years had passed. She said, "Someone went in there with the intention of murdering Irene, and they have to live with that. They have to wake up every morning and look into their heart and soul and think, we've murdered an innocent woman." Jennifer's emotional plea encouraged one woman watching to come forward. In December 2016, she told investigators how, a few months after Irene's murder, she had been in a pub in Castleblaney with her partner. Lamb was also there. A programme about Irene White appeared on the television. Lamb spoke up. "I done that," he said. It seemed to the woman that he needed to share his secret. Now she was doing the same. On the 20th of January 2017, detectives knocked on the door of Anthony Lamb's family home. His sister answered the door to 10 Gardaí with a warrant for her brother's arrest. Anthony began to descend the stairs, dressed in a jumper and denim jeans. He didn't appear surprised or angry by what he saw in the hallway. He was more frustrated by their timing, saying, "Today of all days, lads," referring to the fact that if they had waited another hour, his parents would not have been home to watch him as he was arrested. Gardaí brought Lamb to the station, where they took DNA samples and fingerprints to compare to those found at the crime scene. As Lamb entered the station, Detective Inspector Pat Murray watched him and thought he appeared resigned to his fate. Lamb was cautioned and brought into a room with the same 2 detectives who had spoken to the key witness in Australia, Detective Gardaí Bobby Ogle and Rachel Riley. As they sat down, Gardaí were confident they had their killer, but there were still questions about his motive and his reasonings. There was much they needed answered. In the interview room, Lamb opened up about his memories from the months leading up to Irene White's murder. He had been studying civil engineering at Dundalk Institute of Technology and was struggling with drug and alcohol addiction at the time. It had left him in debt. Whatever wages he received from his then boss, Niall Power, he spent on drink and drugs. In December 2004, someone approached him with an opportunity to make some money. Thousands of euro, easily enough to clear his debt. In return, he would have to kill Irene White. Lamb was reluctant at first and told detectives how the conversations didn't seem real. The person who made the offer made it again to Lamb, and again, multiple times a week. Lamb told detectives that this person became more and more insistent. Eventually, he relented. He agreed to the job, to kill Irene White. Lamb described the pressure that was put on him to accept as relentless. Detectives' suspicions that Irene's death had been a contract hit was confirmed, but they still needed to know who was behind the plot. In March of 2005, Lamb was given his instructions. He was to follow Irene to Carrickdale Gym, 15 minutes away from her home in Dundalk. There he was to attack her with a knife. After arriving at the gym, Lamb decided he couldn't go through with it. He turned around and headed home, dumping the knife as he left. But even as he walked away, he knew he could not escape the situation. He had no way out. He knew too much. If he didn't follow through with his part of the deal, he would be in danger himself. And so he agreed again to kill Irene White. He was promised €20,000. This time, the plan was to kill her at her home, Ice House. Lamb and his contact for the job went for a walk around Ice House Hill Park. It was Lamb's first time in the park. His contact pointed out Irene's house and how Lamb could escape into the park after carrying out the murder. The contact highlighted the CCTV cameras in the area and how best to avoid them. They gave Lamb a knife and advised him to stab Irene once or twice in the chest. They told Lamb Irene's routine and how to lure her out of the house by telling her the gates were left open. It was 2 weeks later when Lamb would act on those instructions. Around 10 o'clock in the morning of the 6th of April 2005, Anthony Lamb approached Ice House. He was high on cocaine. He wore dark jeans, a hoodie, wool gloves, a ski mask and runners. He hopped over the wall from the park and knocked on the door of Ice House. When Irene White opened the door, Lamb stabbed her in the chest. Irene fell backwards and shouted at Lamb to stop. He asked him why he was doing it. Lamb broke down, but he knew it was too late. In a frenzy, he continued stabbing her until she fell to the ground. He then cut her throat. Before he fled the scene, he knelt down beside Irene and recited the Our Father. He picked up the knife and ran from the house and on through the park. As he told detectives the horrifying story of that day, Lamb repeatedly apologised for what he had done to Irene and her family. The Gardaí on duty in the station could see he was consumed by his guilt. It was clear how relieved he was to finally confess. He thanked the interviewers and even hugged them. In a book about the case, The Ice House Murder with Robin Schiller, Detective Inspector Pat Murray would later recall how, when he was leaving for the day, he looked in on Lamb in his cell. He was pacing in the small room. Lamb looked at Murray through the cell door hatch and asked him if he was the detective who had been on crime call appealing for information with Irene's daughter, Jennifer. Lamb had never met Irene before he killed her. He hadn't even seen a picture of her face before she answered the door that day, but he told Murray that he remembered her voice. When he heard Jennifer on crime call appealing for information, she sounded just like her mother. Lamb had been watching it with his parents. He was so shaken watching the programme and hearing Jennifer's voice that he had got up from the couch and gone to his bedroom. He stayed there crying for 6 hours. Murray thought that Lamb appeared genuinely remorseful. Detectives continued to question Lamb and asked him about what happened after the murder. He told them he ran through Ice House Hill Park to his car and drove home to Castleblaney. When he arrived, he met his mother. Trying to explain the blood all over his clothes, Lamb told her he had come across a motorbike accident. He put the clothes on a boil wash before he got into the shower and headed into Castleblaney to buy new clothes. Around 11:40 a.m, he went to Dundalk Institute of Technology, where he would meet his boss, Niall Power. Gardaí already knew that Niall Power had met Anthony Lamb that day. Power had claimed it was an advance on wages, but now Lamb admitted the truth. The €1,000 he was given that day was a payment for the murder of Irene White. Niall Power had arranged it all. Gardaí began to ask more about his connection with Niall Power and the phone calls between the two that day. The call at 9:44 a.m. from Power to Lamb matched perfectly with the time Irene would have been leaving her children's school after talking to another parent. Lamb suggested that the call was Power letting him know that she was on the way home. The next call, around 10:15, was to confirm her death and to arrange the exchange of money. And then another call an hour and a half later when he was on his way to meet him. Lamb described this meeting as weird. As soon as they arrived, Power handed over the money. €1,000, cash. Power had withdrawn it earlier that day. Then they stepped out of their cars and walked. Power began to ask Lamb about the murder. Had it all gone to plan? Why couldn't he meet him earlier? Lamb told him it did and that he wanted to go home to get rid of the bloody clothes. Then Power asked why he had stabbed her so many times. 34 times. Lamb hadn't known how many times he'd stabbed Irene. He told Power he panicked. Lamb told detectives how he met Power again later that summer and was paid another €1,000 for the murder of Irene, the final payment. Not quite the €20,000 initially promised. Lamb was charged with the murder of Irene White. In Ireland, there is no incentive for a person to plead guilty to murder. Unlike other crimes where it can act as a mitigating factor, murder has a mandatory life sentence and the judge has no discretion when it comes to sentencing. So typically, even when faced with a wealth of evidence against them, murderers will plead not guilty in the hope that they will be able to argue against the prosecution's case. Unusually, when he appeared in Dublin's Central Criminal Court on January 29, 2018, Lamb chose to plead guilty. His defence counsel, Jonathan Kilfeather, explained how Lamb had been affected by sexual abuse he suffered as a child, and how he was in a very bad place at the time of the murder. The family of Irene White sat in the courtroom for Lamb's sentencing. They watched an emotionless Lamb in a navy suit and brown shoes as he walked across the road to buy a bottle of water from a nearby coffee dock. For Anne Delcassian, it was clear from looking at the 35-year-old that her sister had stood no chance. I was looking at how fat he is and thinking he was a big farmer's son. What hope did Irene have of defending herself against his strength? Beyond coming face to face with Irene's killer, it was an eye-opening day for the family. They had not heard all the details of the case, or the pathologist's report, as no inquest had taken place. It was here in the court that they learned there were others involved in Irene's murder. Speaking on her behalf, Anne Delcassian's lawyer, Gavin Booth, said, "We realise from what was said in court that there are others responsible for Irene's murder. Lamb was paid and sent there to kill her. We now await these people being brought to justice as well." Irene White's estranged husband, Alan, also attended the sentencing. He was in shock at the revelation that someone had paid to have his wife murdered. Speaking to reporters who gathered outside the court, he said, "It was difficult to hear, but we still got the result." For Gardaí, it was time to turn their attention to Niall Power. By 2018, Gardaí had a strong idea of what happened on the fateful spring day 13 years earlier, when Irene had been murdered. The anonymous tip-off from Australia, which led them to Anthony Lamb's confession, meant they finally had her killer behind bars serving a life sentence. But that didn't mean justice was done. Niall Power, who they believe had pressured Lamb and orchestrated the murder, was still walking free. It was time for detectives to focus on strengthening their case against him. They already had CCTV footage of Power driving by Irene's house on the morning of that fateful day in April 2005, and they knew he had cancelled his plans to attend a security conference at the last minute. Anthony Lamb's confession placed Power as a central figure in the plot to kill Irene, and the telephone records of calls between the two supported that story. There was also the statement given by Power's ex-girlfriend, in which she claimed he and an associate were always scheming to get rid of Irene. But Power had always denied any involvement, and an earlier arrest for withholding information resulted in no charges being brought. On the 30th of January 2018, the day after the sentencing of Anthony Lamb, a man walked into Dundalk Garda station, trembling as he approached the desk. He was a bald man in his late 40s with grey stubble and glasses. Niall Power. He asked the Garda on duty, Sean Murphy, to speak to a detective. He told them that he had information about the murder of Irene White. Garda Murphy asked him if he would wait in the public area while he went to get a detective. The reply, "I'm not going anywhere until I get this off my chest." Power was met by Sergeant John Maroney and Garda Conor McCaughey. He greeted them by saying, "I want to put my hands up. I'm going to ruin a lot of lives here." As tears began to flow, the father of four spoke about his family and how this event had impacted them, and how it had resulted in him losing his business and home, and how he ended up living with his elderly parents. To the guards present, he appeared like a broken man. Power was offered a solicitor, but declined and agreed to a voluntary interview. Sitting down with two Gardaí, 13 years after the vicious murder of Irene White in her own home, Niall Power finally revealed that yes, he had arranged to have her killed. Power had previously hired Anthony Lamb for security work and approached him one day about having Irene done, as he put it. Lamb was surprised by the suggestion, saying, "Whoa, fuck," before offering to get that done for you. Power said he thought Lamb was going to arrange other boys to kill Irene, and told Gardaí how he was shocked to learn that Lamb had gone through with the murder himself. He hadn't known when it would happen or who exactly would undertake the killing. Power admitted he had played a part in Irene's death, but as the interview went on, he insisted that he was simply the middleman in the murderous plot, telling the interviewing Gardaí, "I'm not the big instigator in this." Power had gotten to know Irene through a mutual acquaintance, and between 2003 and 2004, they began to pressure Power to sort Irene White out. This suggestion had been repeated almost every day thereafter. As time dragged on, the pressure on Power continued to build. Power perceived a threat to his security business if he didn't go through with the plot. Power told Gardaí he felt like a puppet. He had gone too far to back out. Power said he would face questions about the delay. In turn, Power would then squeeze Lamb to do his part. Power recalled the morning of the 6th of April when Lamb called to tell him that he had murdered Irene White. "It was like my soul left me that morning. I thought my mother and father didn't rear me like this," he said. "I crossed the border. I could not go back. I'm going to deserve everything I get." On July 11th, 2019, dressed in a grey shirt and suit jacket, Niall Power appeared before Mr. Justice Michael White at the Central Criminal Court. Asked how he would plead, Power replied, "Guilty." Alan White, Irene's estranged husband, described being numb when he learned that his former business associate was pleading guilty to her murder. During the sentencing hearing, Niall Power's barrister, Michael Bowman, expressed his client's deepest apologies to the friends and family of Irene White and all those affected. Handing down the mandatory life sentence, Mr. Justice Michael White said the murder was an unspeakable crime and a great tragedy. He also spoke of the family's long fight for justice. 14 years had gone by since Irene's tragic murder, Her younger children were now adults. Her mother had passed away shortly after finding her daughter lying in a pool of blood, and her sister, Anne Delcassian, was battling terminal cancer. Speaking after the sentencing, Anne's solicitor, Kevin Winters, reminded the waiting media that the mastermind behind Irene's murder, whoever had directed Niall Power, remained elusive. He urged the Gardaí and the DPP to bring charges against them before it was too late for Anne Delcassian to see justice for her sister. Gardaí knew this person's identity. They had identified them as a possible suspect years earlier. Gardaí believed they had been the apex, bridging together Irene White, Niall Power and Anthony Lamb. But now the two men convicted of her murder told Gardaí that they would not testify against the person who gave them their orders, for fear of being labelled as informers in prison. The Gardaí would have to continue to build their case. Before they could complete it, Anne Delcassian, Irene's sister who had fought tirelessly for justice, passed away on the 9th of August 2019. At her funeral, she was remembered by her husband Kenny and her two daughters, who spoke about their mother's spirited nature and her determination. Her courage to face up to any situation was also spoken about during the interfaith celebration, which took place in the chapel adjacent to Glasnevin Cemetery. In the years that followed Anne's death, her husband Kenny took up her ongoing fight for justice and to expose all the apostles of evil who he said were involved in the death of Irene White. Anne had believed that it was a wider group of up to 12 who played their part, be it orchestrating the plot or getting rid of the clothes Anthony Lamb wore that morning. In 2023, Gardaí had finally gathered enough evidence to send a file to the DPP, recommending that the prime mover, the mastermind, be charged with Irene White's murder. One source who spoke to journalist Robin Schiller said, "The DPP has directed charges on far less." Gardaí were convinced that there was enough evidence in the file for a charge to be brought against the suspect. For Irene White's family, this was a massive breakthrough. By November of 2023, the DPP had made a decision. This was the moment that Irene's family had fought for since her death in 2005. The DPP announced that they would not bring charges against this suspect. Reacting to the news, a bitterly disappointed Kenny Delcassian quoted the philosopher John Stuart Mill saying, "Bad men need nothing more to compass their ends than that good men should look on and do nothing." He continued by saying that such evil cannot go unchallenged, and that to do so could create a world full of murderers, convinced that they can get away with such a thing. Niall Power lodged an appeal in 2025, claiming that he was suffering a mental breakdown at the time he pled guilty to murder. Speaking to Robin Schiller and Pat Murray for their book about the case, The Icehouse Murder, Alan White addressed speculation that he had been the mastermind behind the murder. As he has always done, he denied this allegation. He said, "I'm glad they think I've the intelligence for it." White has spoken to the media several times over the years and answered questions about suspicions he may have been the driving force behind the murder of Irene. He spoke to the Irish Mirror in 2023 and said he thought there were still unanswered questions about his wife's killing. He said it doesn't make sense. The reporter asked him how he felt about some people suspecting him. He said people make their own minds up. And then he insisted that if he was to be charged with any involvement in Irene's murder, he would argue his innocence in court. Irene White's family continued to fight for justice and for answers about the mastermind behind her death. They have promised to bring justice to anyone else involved in her murder, no matter how long it might take. Thank you for listening to this episode of Lines of Enquiry. If you're enjoying the podcast, leaving a rating or review really helps. We've now passed 5,000 5-star ratings on Spotify, along with a growing number of reviews on Apple Podcasts. Those reviews make a real difference and help new listeners find the series. Make sure you like and subscribe to the podcast to get notified whenever a new episode is released. If you're listening on Spotify, you can also leave a comment on this episode. We read every comment, and we're genuinely grateful for the time you take to share your thoughts. You can get in touch with us directly by emailing linesofenquiry@goloudnow.com if you have a question or a case you'd like us to cover. We'd love to hear from you. Follow us on Instagram at Lines of Enquiry Podcast. And if you can, share the podcast with others. Lines of Enquiry is presented by me, John Sweetman. The podcast is created by Darren Cleary. Our executive producer is Owen Brennan. Producer is Siobhan Walsh. This episode was written by Siobhan Walsh and edited by Owen Brennan. Sound design and editing by Neil Kavanagh, with legal, marketing and social media support from the team at GoLoud. Sources for this episode include The Argus, Evening Herald, The Irish Times, The Times, RTE, Extra.ie, Irish Examiner, Irish Mirror, Irish Independent, Crime World Podcast, and The Ice House Murder by Robin Schiller and Pat Marry. Join me next time as we open another case and follow the evidence wherever it leads. Because, in the end, everything done in the dark comes to light.